Welcome back to the bottom line up front. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
And I'm Jonathan Duprat, the Chief Communications Officer at Artorias. And, thank you everyone for being here today. Just before we get started, a very big part of what makes this episode is kind of the actual technology back here at Artorias. We've been tracking this for a while with sentiment analysis. We've been really keeping our ear close to the ground with all the protests, which has really informed us on taking the direction with this episode. There are other factors as well in terms of analysis. For example, I myself am actually a Venezuelan American, so this is a episode that's a little more personal to me. But going back, yes, this episode has largely been driven by our analysis on the ground, what's going on, with the movement and its ebb and flow, especially this past week with Maduro's inauguration on January the 10th.
Yeah, John, I think it's important to highlight that, our sentiment analysis and our LLM models and AI reporting has picked up a lot on the situation in Venezuela and the potential increased levels of instability in Venezuela. So for our listeners who are not very familiar with kind of the current situation in Venezuela, as John alluded to earlier, Nicolas Maduro was sworn in on 10th January, last Friday, as president of Venezuela for an additional term, in where the elections happened last year, and Maduro, for all intents and purposes, claimed victory, or even though by all independent observers, he clearly lost the election against the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez. Edmundo Gonzalez was kind of a candidate that the opposition in Venezuela kind of coalesced around because the nominal leader, probably the de facto leader of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado, was deemed by the Supreme Court of Venezuela ineligible to run for supposed crimes that she committed, which clearly was trumped up charges and a political case that kind of weakened the Venezuelan opposition. When Maria Corina Machado was ineligible to run, Edmundo Gonzalez became the figure that the opposition coalesced around, and the elections that occurred last year, by most independent observers, he probably won the election easily by over 60% of the vote. But for those who are not familiar, when you're talking about Venezuela and kind of the nation state and the political body of Venezuela, a lot of the organs of the state, such as the Consejo Nacional de Elecciones, the National Commission election, is basically run by Maduro loyalists of the former Chavista regime. And they do not, unlike the United States, where you have kind of this technocratic bureaucracy, apolitical government officials, Venezuela is wholeheartedly run by Maduro loyalists. That electoral commission declared that Maduro won re-election, and that caused massive protests, late summer of 2024, that the Maduro regime, as has done in the past, and even the Chavista regime, has basically fallen back on very oppressive tactics to suppress those protests and ensure that Maduro continues to stay in power. That kind of culminated with his inauguration last Friday. Maria Corina Machado announced publicly prior to the inauguration of Maduro that on the 9th and 10th of January, there was going to be protests against Maduro's inauguration. And on 9 January, we actually saw a significant amount of protests in Venezuela. And briefly, Maria Corina Machado was actually detained by the Maduro regime. And she, under duress, was forced to kind of make this very weird public statement, video statement that just kind of seemed completely out of the ordinary, where she said, "No, I'm fine. I wasn't detained." Subsequent statements from the opposition clearly stated that she did that video confession under duress, not of her free will. And really, that is kind of where the situation has been kind of since then. As I mentioned earlier, the opposition presidential candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, Shortly after the elections last year, he fled to Spain, where he was actually granted political exile. And the United States and a significant amount of countries, even in Latin America, surprisingly, have recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the president-elect, and almost as the rightful president of Venezuela. A lot of countries are not recognizing Maduro's election and presidency as legitimate. And Edmundo Gonzalez had this very kind of like foreign policy centric focus in which he would be kind of representing Venezuela for the international community. Just recently, he was in the Dominican Republic meeting with the president and key leaders of the Dominican Republic. Prior to that, he was in Washington, D.C., where he met with President Biden and even members of President-elect Trump incoming administration, specifically the National Security Advisor, the next National Security Advisor. And so the opposition has kind of taken this two-tracked approach where, by all intents and purposes, it looks like Maria Corina is leading kind of this Venezuelan domestic policy focus, right? And taking action within Venezuela. While Edmundo Gonzalez is kind of focusing on the international community and trying to present this image as a head of state outside of Venezuela. As of this recording, there was unconfirmed reports, I think it's important to highlight, that our AI picked up specifically, that Edmundo Gonzalez left the Dominican Republic and that there is conversations that he might be actually heading to Venezuela specifically to try to make an appearance in Venezuela as the president-elect, and almost at this point, almost as its president, because the inauguration almost happened. That, time will tell if that actually is confirmed. That's what happens. But clearly, the opposition is just not going to take Maduro's inauguration at face value, and we're seeing that this is a fight that they're going to continue to do, and that's kind of been the story of the opposition: is how do they present themselves not only as the legitimate government, but more importantly, the actual rulers of Venezuela that have the political control of not only kind of the national political body of Venezuela, but more importantly, the military. Because for now, the military, for the most part, is loyal to the Maduro regime, and Nicolas Maduro relies on the military to maintain his power. So John, as you mentioned, your kind of your personal connection to this, your background, and in a lot of the reporting that Artorias AI has picked up. Where do you think the opposition moves from here? What is the next steps that the opposition can do? And do they actually have a clear plan to undermine Nicolas Maduro?
Yeah, so before I go into that, I definitely want to mention specifics about the elections, the previous two specifically that Maduro has been in, because the conflict that the opposition has been waging against the Maduro regime ever since the very beginning is very much tied to the results of those elections. So the first election was actually a very close one. This was back in, I want to say 2013 was the first official one that Maduro was involved in. Although I might be completely wrong and mixing it up with the time that Chavez was around. But that specific election, Maduro won by a very, very small margin. Yeah, I think 2 to 3% against, I believe in this time it was Enrique Capriles. Then you have 2018, which was a much more split election that Maduro won by a quote unquote landslide. Obviously, the results of that election were very heavily discussed, and there's a lot of speculation that the third candidate in that election was specifically put there to be a spoiler and split the vote. And then you have this most recent election, which you look at the two results. You can look at Comando con Venezuela, which is the widely accepted opposition results. And then there's obviously the Consejo Nacional, the Electoral Commission, which is Maduro's result. And Maduro's result is actually somewhat tight. It's 51.9% against 43.18% with the rest of the votes in there kind of split. And there were some jokes during the election day about how 120 plus % of the vote had been counted. But for all intents and purposes, this election was a landslide in favor of the opposition. Edmundo Gonzalez won, as you said, over 60% of the vote, 67, I believe, 67% of the vote, which is a landslide against Maduro, only winning, I believe it was 25 to 30-ish percent. But yes, going back to the opposition, over the years, the opposition has certainly evolved, but in my eyes, they have never been willing to take the steps necessary to really push things over the finish line. And you can argue that may be by no fault of their own. Specifically, the fact that they've been trying to do the whole peaceful revolution sort of thing, trying to bring in international support. And the international community has been very supportive. The United States has been very supportive. The European Union has been very supportive, as have various other democratic administrations across the world. But for me, there's kind of a disconnect between the politicians of the opposition and the reality on the ground, which is that, yes, the military is a strong institution in Venezuela that was very strong during the era of Chavez, with the exception of the 2002 coup. And I will go back to this, by the way. And it has been even stronger during the time of the Maduro regime, arguably, because after the 2002 coup, there was a significant purge, but it was not a complete purge. There was some reconciliation of the people involved. So there's been this disconnect where, the opposition doesn't want to make it violent. They don't want to create martyrs. And, again, I'm not advocating for violence, but the reality kind of is that based on previous trends in Venezuela, there has to be a harsher, more intense push by the opposition. They cannot rely on international support because the international community, they can say things, but they're not going to do things. The international community supporting Edmundo Gonzalez isn't going to make him be the president.
No, and I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because in 2018, during the first Trump administration, they're almost, maybe not. And I think the term I think you mentioned is probably forceful, but I think it's important to highlight that forceful does not necessarily mean violence. In which the opposition, had a plan in place where there was understanding even that the military was going to switch sides, and that there was this very famous video within kind of the recognized, at least by the United States and large segments of the international community, where the Venezuelan opposition leader, who was kind of the president of the Venezuelan parliament, who the United States recognized as the president-elect, released this video statement with with military personnel in the background saying, "I am now the president." And that was probably the closest we ever saw of Nicolas Maduro actually fleeing the country. There was reports that he was basically very close to evacuating the country. It took actually the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, to personally call Nicolas Maduro with the support of Cuba, which is a main backer. I think a lot of people, when they look at Venezuela, they look at the oil that Venezuela provides to Cuba as its lifeline. But people don't necessarily see what Venezuela gets in return as kind of this internal security support, where Cuban military personnel and intelligence services personnel are very active in Venezuela, mainly to maintain the support of Nicolas Maduro and the Chavista regime and the Maduro regime. And it was a very last second push by President Putin and by Cuba to ensure that Nicolas Maduro didn't flee. But that video was very famous. The president-elect at that time had the military in the video, and then there was this idea that the opposition managed to get the military on their side. Clearly, the vast majority of the military did not support the Venezuelan opposition. And I think the key figure to this that is very key in maintaining the loyalty of the military for the Maduro regime is Vladimir Padrino Lopez, right? The Minister of Defense. He's been Minister of Defense since 2014. He has a very long time. Back in 2018, when this kind of occurred, there was this idea that they managed to switch Vladimir Padrino and to support the opposition. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the former national security advisor of President Trump, John Bolton, even alluded to this, that they looked like they managed to get an agreement to switch the Venezuelan military to support the opposition, which didn't come to fruition. And so where the interesting aspect, and I believe it, I'm sorry, I mentioned 2018, and I think it is 2020, after the election. So 2020 when that occurred. But I think, John, what you're mentioning very specifically is something that's kind of interesting in this, right? And it's that, in what aspects does the opposition take a more forceful response that does not necessarily mean violence? It is important to highlight, during the previous election in 2024, when Maduro basically stole the election and managed to clamp down very heavily on the protests that were occurring in Venezuela, you did see certain levels of violence. Now, again, historically, prior to 2024, where some elements of violence would occur is some dissatisfied member of the military, kind of these Venezuelan rebels who would kind of defect from the military, maybe take some armed struggles. But it wasn't very coordinated. They weren't at large scale. It was in very small numbers, not necessarily threatening the Maduro regime. Post the 2024 election, there was this one specific group that was a gang, an identified gang in Venezuela, called Tren de Llano, not to be confused with Tren de Aragua, which is we'll talk about them later in the episode. But Tren de Llano, which is a gang very active in Venezuela, basically vocally declared war on the Venezuelan military and the Maduro regime. Now, again, Tren de Llano doesn't have the numbers to really threaten Venezuela, and Venezuela, even, a lot of people, when they talk about authoritarian governments, there's this false belief that authoritarianism equals security. That is not the case in Venezuela. Violence has actually gone up. Organized crime and gangs have increased their level of control. A lot of them supported actually by the Maduro regime. You've seen conflicts specifically along the border with Colombia, with FARC dissident groups really challenging the state. But this Tren de Llano kind of attacks and uprising that lasted, that peaked around August to September and has died down significantly since then, was probably the first time we saw maybe a more organized push from this violent threat. But the opposition, really since 2020, since that kind of failed push to be more forceful, hasn't really developed a concrete plan to kind of force Maduro out. Again, 2020 was the last time. And so I think, John, you bring an interesting aspect. And again, people shouldn't confuse it with violence. But how does the Venezuelan opposition force Maduro out? Is it a situation now that Maduro doesn't have international backing like he did the last time in 2020? Russia is consumed with Ukraine. The Russians couldn't save Bashar al-Assad in Syria, which is more of a strategic importance to Russia than Venezuela. Cuba has significant amount of economic problems. And so is there a push now, if the Venezuelan opposition, again, is more forceful, not violent, but forceful, can they manage to get Maduro out? I mean, where do you see this kind of lying in, John?
A place that I have always advocated for, and I think if you can ask a lot of Venezuelans, they'll have a very similar opinion. The opposition needs to make a very simple, and when Juan Guaido was, the last time this happened, when Juan Guaido was trying to do the big push, there was the same exact thought came to mind. The same exact thought came to mind on January 10th. Go for the presidential palace. Go for Palacio Miraflores. It's especially the last time with Juan Guaido, there was an open line. They got very close to the palace, and then, it just fizzled out. And that's not necessarily a call for violence. Going for the presidential palace is not a call for violence. Maduro is not even there when these kind of things happen, but it's a symbolic thing. The images of Palacio Miraflores being, infiltrated by protesters would send a very strong message. And here's another fact, and this is why I wanted to mention the 2002 coup, because I really do think this is relevant. The Venezuelan military is in a very comfortable position nowadays. They don't get deployed against the populace as much as people like to think. Actually, that's the job of groups like the colectivos, who are usually gang members that are deployed by the government, to go and inflict some fear on the regular populace very effectively as well. These colectivos, they are not dressed in uniform. They will come up on motorcycles. They will gun down protesters. This has been something that Venezuela has been dealing with for over 20 years. It's something that's well understood. They're a little easier to pick out of the crowd now, but there's still a form of terror used on the populace. So the military doesn't really get deployed that much. Every once in a while, they will get sent out there if things get a little too escalated. But why do I bring up going to the Palacio Miraflores, the presidential palace? In 2002, there was a political crisis going on at the time that leads up to the 2002 coup. And that was when the military turned against Chavez. And the reason the military turned against Chavez is because the military did not want to gun down civilians, and they thought that's where the crisis was going. That was the impression that they got of where the crisis was going to end up, was going to be they would have to gun down civilians en masse and have massacres across places like Caracas, the capital. So they turned against Chavez, and they're like, listen, we're not going to do this. Get out. That's a very, very, very basic explanation of what happened. It's a little more complicated, but it's a very basic idea of what happened. And I think, if you can recreate that situation, I think the military would go and have the same exact thought. We're not going to do this. We're not going to gun down the populace. The Air Force, the Venezuelan Air Force, very liberal organization up until this day. If they were put in a position of pressure, and actually you did see this, by the way, you did see anti-air assets be deployed en masse last week, which does show that the Venezuelan military understands that the Air Force is still a problem to this day. So, yes, I think you need to create a situation where the military has to choose a side, but they've never been put in that position. They've always been sitting there in the background.
So I think that's a great point, and I think building off of that, a few things that you can look at. You brought it up exactly. Sort of expanding the broader population and support from the population for the opposition does put that, or would put the military in that sort of position again. And I think you can also appeal to the foot soldiers, obviously, a lot more easily than you can to the high-ranking military officials, because the foot soldiers are not benefiting nearly as much as the high-ranking officers, not even close. So if you put them in that position while at the same time undermining that cohesion within the military, I think that gives you a better chance of getting those defections when they matter most. And that, we were talking about the 2020 coup attempt by contractors. It was so poorly planned. There should have been no real expectation that the military was going to do that at that time. And that's obviously the planning, the lack of understanding, the using foreign contractors, it being coordinated by former U.S. military contractor, at least in part. All of that actually, I think, made Maduro stronger at the end of that, at least temporarily. So yeah, I think those are all great points.
So I think, Matthew, there's two separate events to analyze, right? There's the one that you're mentioning, right, in 2020, which the Maduro regime heavily leveraged, right? Kind of this very much kind of reminiscence of the Bay of Pigs. And then the Guaido uprising, where that was an internal dynamic within Venezuela, in that where the Venezuelan military, that was probably the closest point where we saw the Venezuelan military transition to supporting the opposition, which I think is to John's point, right? And I think, one of the aspects of Maduro, clearly Maduro's center of gravity is kind of this internal security. So the 2019 was the closest we ever got when Guaido did the uprising, and it's a very famous video where he's standing there talking, and he has key military personnel behind him, and there was this idea that, okay, now during the first Trump administration, where the Venezuelan military, was going to switch, And it took Russia and Cuba to kind of say to Maduro, don't leave, right? That stay and put, we'll maintain it. And what it showed was is that from the military standpoint, at least in large segments, they were looking at necessarily, well, who's going to win this fight, Guaido or Maduro, right? Clearly, Maduro, through Padrino, has significant strength and control over the military, but it's not absolute. And one of the interesting aspects post 2002 coup was what Chavez learned from it, and which basically a lot of authoritarian leaders learn from, is a lot of times the greatest threat to your control of power comes from the military. And Chavez really pushed heavily this idea of, because again, remember, Chavez was a former military official in the Venezuelan military. Like he was a senior field grade officer in the Venezuelan military, I believe a lieutenant colonel, who led a failed coup in 1992. And he famously said, basically, we failed now, but we will eventually succeed. And then he won via an election, right? So Maduro, based on his failed coup attempt when he tried to seize power in the 90s, and then when he suffered the coup, understood that he needed to have control of the military. And so what you saw was not only the politicization of the Venezuelan military, making it more of a political identity, more of a political body of Chavez and then of Maduro, but then creating policies in place to maintain that control, either by creating, for example, that which is part now of the Venezuelan armed forces, right? Those milicianos, the Venezuelan militia, which is part of the military. Um, they created kind of like the strategic command that is responsible for providing oversight over the Venezuelan military, right? And those are institutions created within Venezuelan's military, officially to control the state and to ensure survival of the regime. You see the same with the National Guard transitioning to basically being the vanguard of the Maduro regime. But and so that's kind of the official aspect. But the unofficial aspect is 2 points. One, the incorporations of Cuban intelligence and military personnel. And there's a wide based reporting to indicate that even Maduro's personal security comes from Cuba, right? So that's kind of like an unofficial. We saw before, the Russians invasion Ukraine, Wagner was reportedly had a significant presence as well as Venezuela. But to John's point, more importantly, and there's another aspect of unofficial control, is los colectivos, right? And the colectivos are basically thugs. That's all they are. They're thugs of the Venezuelan government, wholeheartedly utilized to maintain control, specifically in neighborhoods that might be either a great threat that don't generally support the Maduro regime, or to ensure loyalty within segments of, let's say, Caracas that might historically have supported Maduro, but because of the economic crisis that Venezuela is suffering, might lose support. And so the colectivos are these strongmen thugs utilized to maintain that control. And a lot of times, it's the colectivos that are actually deployed first to suppress the opposition. And so we're not really seeing a plan in place by the opposition to change that. Because protest after protest, after uprising, Maduro manages to suppress them. He basically wins by time, and he does mass detention. The Venezuelan Internal Security Services is very effective at clamping down against the Maduro regime.
Yeah. There's two aspects I want to add to this. There's also a huge aspect of corruption that keeps the modern military in line. Venezuela has a comical amount. Like when people make these jokes about, authoritarian militaries having a bunch of generals that have a bunch of awards and ribbons and medals. That's the Venezuelan military. They have over 300 generals, and that's just generals. This is not including other kinds of officers below that. It is a ridiculous amount of high command in a military that is not even remotely involved outside of its own borders. So you have that, and another thing, and this is something that is definitely a lot more on the ground and personal. There is a very deeply rooted black market that is intrinsically tied to the Venezuelan military. A lot of the food distribution in Venezuela is specifically run directly by corrupt portions of the military and not the people at the top, even people in officer levels. That's why the Venezuelan military, for the most part, kind of just sits back and lets things happen. Granted, I do believe if enough pressure was put on them, they would have to choose sides, and that we did see that during Guaido's attempt. I think Guaido's attempt was actually a lot closer than what we saw in 2024. I do believe that 2024 was a genuine letdown by the opposition in terms of the momentum they were building, because Maria Corina didn't really sustain the momentum the way she should have. The way that Guaido did. Guaido was sustaining protest after protest for weeks on end. There were a lot of just quiet periods from election day to inauguration day. There was not a sustained amount of momentum. And then my last bit, Venezuelan immigrants, and this one's another one that's really personal to me. My mother is a Venezuelan immigrant. She came to the United States and naturalized in the 1980s, became a citizen of the United States. However, Venezuela does not recognize that. She's not an American citizen in the eyes of the Venezuelan government. And this goes for a lot of the Venezuelan community abroad who have gone to Spain and have become citizens, who have gone to the United States and become citizens. They are not recognized as being citizens of other countries. So when they return to Venezuela, they are effectively held hostage. So that results in situations. My mother has not gone back to Venezuela in over 15 years. So you also don't have the opportunity for the diaspora to play a bigger role at home, because if they go back, there's no telling if they'll be able to leave because of situations like that. But Matthew, I saw you wanted to speak, so do go ahead.
Well, so I do think you make a great point about that black market. Um, and it's also things like illicit drugs, but that is something that a cohesive, more unified opposition could really highlight to use to sort of shame some of the honest members within the military, um, the lower ranking ones, obviously, but also to really get that message to the people who are suffering, the civilians out there, and reminding the people in the military that they also have families and they have extended families. And I'm sure that, there's difficulty providing for everyone in those situations. And that's brings me way back to when you were talking about the palace. It's this is one of those, it's at this point you see it in so many different coups where the next thing that they take or try to take is the media, or they do it simultaneously.
Yeah, and that's something that I think the opposition has just failed on. I think they have failed to highlight the rot per se. Even the opposition kind of sits back, in my eyes at least. Again, this is very subjective to my experience as Venezuelan American. What I see is that they don't push hard enough on things like that. They don't highlight it because I think a lot of Venezuelans do take it for granted. A lot of these different corrupt systems are taken for granted. But if they were highlighted, if you really riled the people up, you could see a very similar situation to what happened during the Guaido attempt that again just fell apart here. And I I'm gonna be honest, I don't know if the opposition will have another chance. I'm a little I hate to sound worse for wear, but I really do sound like I don't see this working out in the future
Well,
again.
so one of the things that you were talking about, the diaspora, um, that's going to have a huge effect on the countries next to Venezuela. So as great as they may be in their own right, whatever you may think of them, that's not the subject of of the podcast, but they're going to be strained by civil unrest and protests and people who feel that they need to flee Venezuela. And that would be an opportunity for opposition to once again get these countries to apply even more diplomatic pressure.
So I think one of the aspects, right? Because it's interesting when we're analyzing Venezuela, which I mean has the largest refugee crisis in modern day, and it's interesting in that aspect that Venezuela is not a country in civil war. It's not a country that has been invaded or suffering really any serious armed conflict that has the largest refugee crisis. It's almost as if, though, that creates a situation for Maduro where it almost provides a level of stability for him. And what do I mean by this? Right, Maduro kind of thrives, the Maduro regime specifically thrives in instability, right? A lot of the actions, as John has mentioned earlier, that Maduro does to stay in power weakens the state in and of itself. But that weakening of the state enables Maduro to stay more in power, entrench himself more in power. And it's almost as if it's kind of a deliberate policy of the Venezuelan government to instigate almost this kind of this mass refugee crisis. Venezuela doesn't prevent it at all. And I think the Venezuelan government analyzes this from a perspective of a lot of the people that flee can probably be the greatest threat to the regime. But then it also provides an opportunity for Maduro to focus limited resources on kind of less of the population centers, right? Because if you look at the border regions, specifically kind of outside of major urban areas in the most remote areas, there's really no such thing as a Venezuelan state. And a lot of them are actually actively controlled by criminal organizations, gangs, organized crimes, mafia, and even declared terrorist groups, right? I mean, if you look at the region of, let's say, Apure, that borders Colombia, right? That is basically an ELN, Ejército Liberal Nacional, fiefdom, right? And the ELN is a declared foreign terrorist organizations by the United States engaged in an active conflict inside of Colombia. But this pushing of Venezuelan migrants across South America also enables Maduro, from an international point of view, Matthew, to your earlier point, it enables Maduro to have a leg up. It's a bargaining chip that he can then leverage to gain concessions from the international community. What I would say, though, that I think 2024, what you are seeing is a more clear break, at least in the diplomatic front, much more than 2018 and previous to that, of the Western Hemisphere, kind of acknowledging that Maduro is no longer in power. But the problem is that we're seeing is that as of right now is not necessarily translating to reality on the ground, right? You can have the organizations of American states, OAS, has been extremely, almost unequivocal, condemning the Maduro regime, right? Maduro, from on many aspects in the Western Hemisphere, is very much isolated. Yes, you might have situations like Brazil sending a representative to Maduro's inauguration. You might have a situation where, obviously Colombia, Petro, kind of, back and forth within kind of this own internal domestic political ideology that Petro has, related to Maduro. But for the most part, Latin America outside of Cuba and Nicaragua is done with Maduro in a lot of aspects, but that's not translating to realities on the ground. And even with the massive immigration crisis, even with the rise of Tren de Aragua being a major threat as a gang in the Western Hemisphere, probably supplanting now, if you look at US political discourse and actually look at everything kind of the US, I mean, Tren de Aragua is a greater threat from a gang perspective than MS-13 is. But we're not seeing that necessarily translate to actions inside Venezuela. And I think that causes also a situation where the international community might be fearful of what a fall of the Maduro regime might cause. And so I think that the only way we're going to actually see changes on the ground is I kind of tend to kind of agree with John, is that it has to be led by the opposition. Now, again, the wild card in the situation, the black swan, as you may, might be the incoming Trump administration, right? The people that have been elected and nominated, I'm sorry, within the Trump administration, specifically Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, that for all intents and purposes, he's probably going to be confirmed. He's been very anti-Maduro, Venezuela hawk. And so what I would be interested to have in this idea is, what does Trump, the incoming Trump administration, what does Marco Rubio do? What is the plans? And do you think they might try to do a repeat of kind of what we saw Guaido do in the past, just now with either Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez? And I think that might be a different situation. I think the Trump administration has a lot of opportunities in Venezuela, much more so than 2019, mainly because a lot of the main backers of Maduro internationally can't provide any level of support to save him this time.
So what I would do is just caveat what you were saying with that hasn't materialized on the ground yet. So I think you can only push your neighbors so far, and that bargaining chip is a short-term option for him, but he's not building any true off-ramps here. For him, the further entrenched he becomes, the more he backs himself into a corner, the fewer options he has to get out of this with his own safety. So maybe there's part of him thinking, if I have a chance, if things do go south, he would rather utilize those options like we saw in Syria and so many other coups across the world throughout history, where the leader chooses to flee because if they don't, sometimes it gets much more violent. So I understand what you're saying in terms of it's not materializing right now, but I think it's not a long-term strategy for him. The economic situation is not likely to get better. A lot of the foreign aid obviously is coming from China, but that can't sustain what they have left of their economy in Venezuela. So I do think it's important to highlight that these could be long-term things, and to tie it back to what you were saying, having a recognized and a truly solid opposition government that is reaching out to the people, that is getting the message out to the people on the ground and creating that groundswell, while simultaneously gaining diplomatic support from their neighbors and from countries, across the hemisphere, and anyone who might be following the situation in Europe. I think that starts to build legitimacy. So I'm thinking, I guess, more long term here than what we're going to see here in the next year or so. And when
Yeah.
these things happen, they move very quickly.
The way I see it, and again, I'm just going to keep going back to Guaido, because even though that was a failure in the end, I do believe it was a lot closer than it is now. I think another big issue the opposition has is they telegraphed their moves too clearly to the government. Maria Corina saying, all right, we're going to get together on January 10th to protest. That's, of course, the government's going to step between that. And you saw a really effective campaign of jamming, of colectivos going out in the days before, and really putting fear into the people. And on January 10th, the protests were not large. There are overhead images of a lot of the protests that form. They are very small compared to previous years. So, yeah, I guess in the long term, I think the best thing the opposition can do is take the 2018 approach, which is let's keep protesting until something happens. It almost worked in 2018. It really did. Like, there was almost a breakthrough there because there was so much sustained momentums. The protests got larger and larger and larger, and they were very reactive to the actions the Maduro regime was taking.
But John, do you think that Maduro then would try to utilize, outside of internal suppression, right? One of the tactics that Maduro tried to do um, recently, when there was kind of this coalescing within the opposition that he thought would look like it was a threat, was the situation with Guyana, or Esquivel, right? Where Maduro held this sham election, the referendum, claiming, Esquivel in Guyana, it should be recognized as, Venezuelan territory, and again, a lot of this was, public bravado within the Maduro regime to try to kind of distract the Venezuelan people from the coalescing of the opposition, kind of this uh, reinvigorated initiative that the opposition had, and he tried to pivot, I think unsuccessfully, to Guyana. Do you think that might be a tactic that we see again if Maduro feels threatened? Do we see now a more forceful approach against Guyana, which has significant, at that point, geopolitical implications for the United States? Not only because of an armed conflict, an interstate armed conflict, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but kind of a lot of the oil explorations that are going around there. That's kind of tied to this internal crisis and the diplomatic crisis. Do we see Maduro try to amp the pressure in Guyana or
Yes,
against Guyana?
yes, but I think if he went for that, it would be genuinely a last hoorah to try and save himself. Like he would have to be in a really tight position for him to do it. Because here's the reality: like a lot of Venezuelan people agree on that point, but a lot of Venezuelan people aren't saying that we should go and exact it. Most Venezuelan people are satisfied with just looking at the map of Venezuela that shows part of Guyana as part of it. Most Venezuelan aren't going to say, "Oh yeah, we actually need to go invade it." Now, if Maduro did go ahead and did that, I don't think many Venezuelans would complain either. But at that point, I think Maduro's going to be dealing with a lot bigger problems than his people. So I feel like he would only ever do that if push came to shove. It would effectively be his Falkland moment.
I think that's a very interesting historical comparisons that we have in South America, and I think it's important. The Falklands, kind of, internal unrest within the Argentinian junta made them to do a wild military operation that, in the end, the loss of the Falklands for the junta led to their overall downfall, and probably one of the most brutal dictatorships that South America has seen. I just think that the situation in Venezuela, and I think, Matthew, you bring up an excellent point about Syria, right? Where, at the start of 2024, and I don't think anybody would have ever predicted that 2024 would end with Bashar al-Assad fleeing Syria to go to Russia. And that could happen in Venezuela. And I think the main difference back when Guaido, was very close. And I would agree with you, John. I think that was an extremely close situation. Even some of the public reporting was he was about to board a plane to flee to Cuba, right? That's how close they were. And it took Vladimir Putin personally to try to intervene. But back then, again, Vladimir Putin probably had a lot more sway and influence where he has now. I do believe Venezuela is in a situation like Syria was prior to Bashar al-Assad falling, but again, it's that domino push. And so for the rebels in Syria, it was the fall of Aleppo. At that point, I think the writing was on the wall that this was almost an inevitable outcome, right? The fall of Aleppo was the domino that needed to fall. The question then in Venezuela becomes, what is the domino to fall? Is it the storming of the presidential palace, right? A massive protest against the presidential palace? Is it a military coup, at least within maybe some lower echelons within the Venezuelan military? Because a lot of people think in a coup, it's the generals, and a lot of times in many coups that happen, it's actually field grade officers, majors, lieutenant colonel, or even sometimes lower ranking general officers. Do we see a situation in Venezuela where that a major, a lieutenant colonel, a colonel leads kind of this coup attempt that ultimately proves successful? Or is it something completely different that's kind of unforeseeable? That is that domino, but that's the question that is hard to predict. What is that first domino to fall? But I would agree with you, Matthew, is that the moment that domino falls, that first domino, it could cause a cascading event that can quickly lead to the fall of the Maduro regime.
Well, and you were talking about how his close protection, his basic equivalent to like this U.S. Secret Service, you were talking about how they might be Cuban, and you see that a lot if you look at the coups in the Sahel, where they're getting protection from Russia, from outside sources. So the the question I want to ask you is, do you also not see the potential for uh, this continuation, the status quo, this um, where you might have a small group of generals um, who are able to make a move and essentially become Maduro 2.0, but with a few more promises to the people and try and make things a little bit better, uh, that could also potentially be a threat.
I think there's a difference in South America. I find it very hard to believe, outside of historically, Cuba might be the exception to this, but for the most part, even in South America, I think that because of the history of it, and there has been this transition. There was this wave of democratic movements in the 80s and the 90s in South America, and there's this understanding of kind of civilian leadership. I find it very difficult to see Venezuela kind of transitioning to even a slightly, I'm going to use this term loosely, but kind of this soft military dictatorship. I don't believe that is kind of within the realms of possibility simply because of how the region and the political ideologies within the region and the historical grievance that it has with this idea of military leadership, right? And so I think that is kind of something that might prevent from something, kind of like that to occur. But one of the important aspects that John touched upon earlier that I think needs to be mentioned about the Venezuelan military, specifically kind of the general officer corps, is, Nicolas Maduro and the Venezuelan military, almost wholeheartedly in many ways, is a drug trafficking organization, right? There's just a term that is used to kind of describe the Venezuelan military, and they're called the Sun Cartel, Cartel del Sol. And the reason why is because the Venezuelan military has the kind of the sun as an emblem and as a symbol, and that's kind of what they've associated with the Venezuelan military. And it's important to highlight that the Venezuelan military is very active in the drug trade, right? And the drug trade not only goes across South America, but goes to the United States, goes to West Africa, up to Europe, right? The Venezuelan military is a drug trafficking organization. And a lot of times when we see Venezuelan military conduct operations against drug trafficking organizations inside of Venezuela, they're not doing it from a counter narcotics point of view of just kind of eliminating any drug trade in the country. They're doing it against their rivals that undermined that dollar value that the Venezuelan military wants. So the Venezuelan military is very targeted and very focused about who they target inside of Venezuela to maintain the monopoly of the drug trade. And I think that is a very difficult situation you're going to run into. However, if you kind of compare that to Syria, because I think there is some parallel, we saw a very similar situation in Syria and the Syrian military with the Captagon trade, right? And then and specifically though, the Captagon trade was very much led by a specific division, the Fourth Armor Division of the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad's regime, which was led by Hafez al-Assad, a family member of Bashar al-Assad. In Venezuela, it's the problem though in Venezuela, it's more widespread than that. It's in various aspects of the Venezuelan military are involved with the drug trade. They have connections with elements of the FARC dissidents. They have relationships with the ELN. They have relationships even with Mexican cartels. And so that is the way that that Maduro uses to kind of maintain that loyalty within the higher echelons of the Venezuelan military, because they do enrich themselves a lot more outside of just general corruption. And those dividends of the drug trade and corruption kind of generally tries to pay down the lower ranks, or there's an understanding within the Venezuelan military at the lower echelons that as long as you're loyal to the Maduro regime, you can be engaged into drug trafficking or other corrupt practices. But that does weaken the professionalism of the force and kind of prevents them then, really, when push comes to shove, similar to what we saw in Afghanistan, where if there's a genuine threat within the Maduro regime, either by violent or nonviolent means, the Venezuelan military probably won't be capable, because of the degradation of its professional force, to really mount a response. But that's kind of the illicit economy of Venezuela. But in many aspects, it's important also to highlight that Venezuela has very vast, large oil reserves, and the Maduro regime and the Chavista regime specifically really leverage the Venezuelan oil to buy support within the local population and in the military, right? I mean, Chavez was very adamant of this idea of Venezuelan oil is kind of the property of the state and for Venezuelan, this idea of kind of nationalizing the oil industry and ensuring that it's there to kind of support the Venezuelan people is kind of engraved in kind of Venezuelan political ideology. But the longer that Maduro is in office, the weaker the Venezuelan oil trade becomes. I mean, Venezuela is not producing that much oil. The corruption that has impacted Venezuela has deeply impacted the Venezuelan oil trade. The post 2002 military coup against Chavez, which in a lot of ways was led by the oil sector and a lot of oil sector workers, forced Chavez to kind of put into place loyalists and not technocrats, which then eventually led to this degradation of the efficiency of the Venezuelan oil market. And so, I think that Venezuela is in a very convoluted, complex state where a lot of signs and indications indicate that Maduro is pretty much entrenched and that the opposition so far clearly hasn't articulated a plan to remove him from power. But at the same time, I think there is an agreement that the moment the first domino falls, it would be very hard for Maduro to stay in power.
Well, and I think that sort of brings us almost full circle to when you were talking about, some sort of force, the term violence of action comes to mind. It doesn't necessarily have to be violence, but it is something that happens very quickly. And is there enough apathy within, you know, the the rest of the military beyond just those very top echelons to actually step in, or is that when you see mass uprisings and they're forced to make the same type of choice that they were afraid they were going to have to make in 2002? And I think we could do a whole episode discussing oil, and the concept you're explaining is known as like the rentier state, and it doesn't allow these countries that rely on a single resource where the economic rents are coming in from abroad. It doesn't allow them to build a true economic diversity. And so that means if something goes wrong with that resource, most of the people are not actually involved in the export of that resource. They're relying on the profits of the export of that resource. So I think that's definitely a facet that we have to explore. And maybe we did a little bit of a disservice at the beginning of this episode, not exploring just a little bit more of that history and how we got here from the fall of oil prices in 2014. So I think that would be an excellent place to do a second part of this sometime in the near future. And I think this might be a good point to end the show. We'll certainly be keeping an eye on it. Thank you so much. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front. Thank you, John. Thank you, Stefano.